I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to speak for the first time at the Atlas Society and at this Atlas Summit. This has been a fascinating afternoon, hearing all the wonderful sessions, and it'll be my pleasure to share some thoughts, some research, and some data points on the Hispanic community, not ignoring, of course, the immigration issue. Whenever I hear the thorny discussion, debate, and the vitriol with the immigration issue, I think of, for some reason, the Dylan Thomas quote, where he described an alcoholic as someone you don't like, but drinks as much as you do. So the notion is here that we're all immigrants, some more than others. And so I'll be delighted to share some research along those lines. A little bit of personal background, as David might have mentioned. I am an immigrant to the nonprofit world, a new immigrant, but my family actually came here from the Dominican Republic during the Trujillo dictatorship. So again, the classic story of a family leaving the dictatorship after the dictator had taken my mother's family's lands, imprisoned my grandfather, injected him with turpentine when he complained about the dictator's activities. And so I think I was born a libertarian conservative when I came to the United States, as my parents, like many, many others before me, certainly heard the story of oppression and came to this country. So I am an unabashed, free market champion. And even though I've spent most of my career in the private sector, I've certainly been observing how the Hispanic community has been growing here significantly. And it was with a lot of alarm that I've watched the community actually lean towards the left, when the reality is that so many, if not most, of Latin American countries have had poor leadership, either authoritarian regimes, dictatorships, and I can go on and on about the oppression that have brought so many to the United States over the years. So without question, the story of immigration is one which has been a controversial one, not just now, but over the last 100 years. Every new culture that's come across the shores has certainly been received with some suspicion and some concern. And without question, the Hispanic community or the Latino community is one of them. So I think most of you have probably heard both terms, Hispanic and Latino. And so if I may just make some distinction between the two terms, because there is a geographical component. The term Hispanic, I'll start with, mostly applies to the Caribbean immigrants that came, and to some degree immigrants from South America, although the immigrants from South America define themselves by their country. Without question, the last thing you want to do is call an Argentine a Hispanic. So essentially, it's mostly the Caribbean nations that came across and were defined as Hispanic during the Nixon administration. In the Department of Commerce, the president was anxious to define a term to talk about the increasing numbers of Latinos that were coming across the shores. And so they decided, one of the administrators decided to use the term Hispanic, and it stuck. However, on the west of the Mississippi in California, the Mexican migration is very, very, very sensitive to the notion of being defined as Latinos. They view themselves as Latinos from Latin America. As North America is defined as one continent, they view themselves as the Latinos coming across from the border. So it's really important to maintain that distinction between the two. I use them interchangeably. But essentially, without moving on here, it is the fastest growing demographic. And so that's the one distinction here. Never has an immigration population grown so quickly. From 1970, we saw 7 million Hispanics to now almost 57 million. The exact number is actually 54 million, because what's actually happening is that the birth rate of the native-born Hispanic community is starting to decrease. We're seeing in Mexico, in particular, that where they normally averaged 4 to 5 children, they're now getting down to 2.1 is the average. And that same change is affecting the Hispanic community here in the United States. So we actually may see a much slower rate of growth than anticipated. Although by all estimates, by 2050, the population is expected to be 106 million people, 25% of the population. The good news is that the purchasing power is increasing along with these numbers. So again, we're talking about over $1.1 trillion of purchasing power. The number is actually closer to $1.33 trillion. And essentially, if Hispanic Americans comprise their own country, they would rank 16 in the world, above Mexico. So Mexico's GDP is $1.293 trillion, and the U.S. Hispanic population exceeds it, right below Spain and South Korea. So there's no business like the spending business in the United States of America, and this community is definitely a part of that. The American demographic, of course, is indeed making itself felt in the composition. And while many deplore the notion that potentially a lot of immigrants are coming from the southern hemispheres and potentially from other cultures, I'm going to give you a lot of good news about the reasons that this should not change the culture of optimism and, I think, work ethic in the United States as defined, as we have known it. Just as rapidly, although growing at smaller numbers and growing rapidly, is the Asian community. So they now make up almost 24%, they almost make up 22% of the United States. Their birth rate is less than the Hispanic community, but they maintain an equally potent part of our culture, of our demographic makeup. The biggest difference between Asians and Hispanics, as you'll soon see, is unfortunately the economic and educational achievements in this country. So again, the buying power of this community is $1.33 trillion. It is a very young but extremely commercially active workforce and very technologically savvy, in the sense that makes it somewhat of a tragedy that they don't make up more of the technology industry, but the Hispanic community is the #1 demographic using mobile video, and they are a very powerful force on social media sites. So it's something that they have a very strong connection to. And again, we certainly see evidence of entrepreneurial activity. Right now, the Hispanic community makes up 3.2 million small businesses in the United States, 3.2 billion, although many of them are sole proprietorships. And among that number, the fastest growing are Latina-owned businesses. So they're basically restaurants, beauty, those type of industries. The main business of Hispanics in the United States right now is construction, in real estate, and in the food industry, where they have a very powerful presence. And again, we're optimistic and we're seeing better numbers in rising levels of educational attainment, but without question, we're only seeing about 20% of Hispanics really go to college, as opposed to 70% in the Asian community and over 50% in the general population. So there's still a huge lag in that regard. But nevertheless, without question, the buying power or the economic contribution in terms of purchasing power in the United States is very much alive. So where and how is the Hispanic community growing throughout the country? Certainly these numbers won't surprise you. The power of the age issue and what this is going to mean for the United States. If the median age of the white population is 42, the black community is 32, Hispanics are 28 years old. And among the American-born Hispanics, the median age is a stunning 18 years old. So if you look forward in terms of optimism and educational achievement, or more importantly, entrepreneurial activity, the big defining definition of this group is that they have a tendency to go into the workforce at an earlier age and and bypass college education and community college education. So that places them at a workforce in the younger age. And again, I'm talking about, by the way, the permanent residents or legal residents of the United States. We'll discuss the undocumented workers and their activities, later. But for the most part, again, we have a very manual labor or labor-intensive force here. And they have a tendency to focus on taking care of their families business-wise, as opposed to postponing that for educational purposes. Okay, so as we look at this map, it's very obvious to see where the Hispanic community is growing and where they're centered. The largest city in the United States for the Hispanic community or Latino community is Los Angeles, where they have 4.7 million people, Hispanic Mexicans in Los Angeles alone. The second largest is in Harris County, in the Harris County area in Texas. The third is Miami-Dade County in the population in Florida. And then from there it goes. So you can see Arizona. Interestingly enough, although it doesn't really show that well on this map, Illinois is actually state number 5 in terms of the largest population of the Hispanic community. So as you can see right in there, they basically have a strong presence. And the statistics in California show that over the next 10 years, they're going to make up over 50% of the state at this rate of population growth. Right now, with a population of 38 million in California, they make up just about 14 million, 15 million at this stage of the game. So the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965 abolished quotas on immigration to the United States. That basically was a movement after the Civil Rights Act, when basically there was a strong movement to encourage not just European immigration to the United States, but to encourage immigration from lesser developed countries around the world. So Senator Ted Kennedy basically launched an initiative that encouraged immigration, or what's now called family unification. So the immigration law was really changed and adjusted so that economic means were not the means testing to become an immigrant or to get citizenship in the United States, but family reunification became the primary source of encouraging immigration or citizenship. The path to citizenship was based on family reunification. This differs markedly from Canada, which has economic means testing. And basically you either have educational attainment or necessary skills in the country to really grant your citizenship. So even though quotas based on immigration to the United States were abolished, there is still per country quota that still is in place. So what does that mean? If you come from a densely populated country, which is looking to come to the United States, such as Mexico or China, there is still a 7% limit to how many permanent resident visas are granted per year. So even if everything were to go right for a Mexican citizen who's looking to come to this country, it takes probably 10 to 12 years to get your permanent residency status or citizenship because there's so many coming from Mexico. Again, China is in the same situation. If you're from Croatia, you can probably become a U.S. citizen within 3 years. So it's all a matter of the density of the population coming to the United States. In many ways, that's why the visa system in the United States became broken, because they weren't able to deal with the vast numbers of people that were seeking to come to the United States, and worse, keep track of whose visas were expiring. So in many ways, that's what I think most of you may understand. The undocumented population, or the illegal population, 60% of this population is due to expired visas, and people have chosen to stay in the United States after their visas have expired. There's no technology that is in place right now in the U.S. government or the immigration system that keeps track of people once their visas have expired. It is a completely antiquated system that hasn't been updated, and it hasn't been updated to this day while the debate has been raging. So if anything, that would be one of the main issues to really address. So is open immigration policy leading to steady migration, and is this really a positive factor for all areas in the United States? And we can discuss this with questions. I think you may be surprised that I actually am not necessarily in favor of constant flow, constant unregulated flow, and constant misunderstanding of who may or may be coming into the country. I think that if we had a sensible and realistically crafted guest worker visa pass that kept track of who was coming into the country, I think that would be better, both economically or certainly would be better, from a policy standpoint. Again, we can talk about all that later. I think that there have been many suggestions, as ill-advised as the cap and trade system was for energy, ridiculously ill-advised, I might add. A cap and trade system for immigration, I think, might be a very interesting solution technologically for the immigration patterns that will continue, I think, for the decades to come, whether from Latin America, whether from Africa, whether from war-torn countries around the world. I think this whole migration pattern to stable political forces is here to stay. So again, now the bad news, I think. Without question, there is a distinct difference between the European cultures and the Latin American cultures. And I have a couple of theories about why that is taking place. But as we can see, the median income of Hispanic households, and that's the median income, is $36,000 a year versus the white or general population, which is $75,000. This chart does not indicate the Asian population average median income, which is actually closer to 90 to 100,000. So they by far are the highest educated and highest income earners in the United States as a demographic. Again, the problems are the educational attainment elements, and while Latinos are the youngest demographic, they are fast becoming the largest and fastest dropouts. Although the rates are dropping, they still lead the pack in terms of dropping out. And what do? They have children at a younger age, they have families at a younger age, and so they drop out to immediately go into the labor workforce. And that really accounts for what's happening here. Sadly, also what's happening is that the Latino families have gone from being the most stable households, two-parent households, to now the out-of-wedlock birth is dominated by Latinas as 50% of the out-of-wedlock births. Again, I'm all for free will and decisions, but again, what happens with single-parent households, particularly with non-educational attainment, is that you're almost doomed to poverty, the poverty class, and that's really one of the main issues. As we can see, the poverty rate for this group is 26%. This poverty rate was also enhanced because the Latino community, the Hispanic community, had a tendency to bundle their wealth as homeowners. So they became almost number one in terms of home ownership in the 2000s. And so if you looked at California, Nevada, Florida, et cetera, they basically almost dominated in terms of home ownership and the subprime mortgage issue. So they benefited on the way up when the housing market was really booming in 2000, in the 1990s, 2000. And then they were the ones that lost 60% of their accumulated wealth when the market dropped so substantially and the delinquencies took place. So they lost 60% of their wealth, and that compares to the general population, and I'm talking 2009, that lost about 20% of their wealth. Because again, the general population mostly has their wealth concentrated in financial markets. This graph just shows, once again, the lags in here, and these are general numbers for incomes under 75,000. Again, you can see the big gap between the general population, and that is a very big gap. Again, it was enhanced because the Hispanic community in general has never been able to recover from the big downturn. And when the housing market resumed its upswing after the crash, really lower to middle income people have much harder time getting bank loans. And that hasn't changed much either because the banking system has gone into a much less productive. Many of the banks are wards of the state now, so they just don't have the lending capacity they used to have. But the income gap also shows itself in the in incomes over $75,000. So you can see it's fairly substantial. Again, these numbers at the bottom too, they actually worry me the most because the Latinos under 75,000 are less invested, and we're looking at average age of 50 years old. So these numbers and when I say savings, I mean savings account. 50% of Latinos in the United States do not have bank accounts. Again, this is a reflection of the extremely unstable banking systems that have gone through significant volatility over the last 50 years. And I know working in the marketplace when I did, that every 4 or 5 years the banking systems would blow up in Argentina, Venezuela, et cetera. So this has left many of these in the community with a very, very unhealthy view towards the banking system and its stability. But on the other hand, this also creates some issues with helping people understand how important it is to be invested in the financial markets and how that's a stake in the country that will really damage savings and future savings. So you can see the rest of the savings gap and investment gap, that's really what I'm talking about, in the rest of the financial markets. Again, so those are the bad financial statistics. The reason to be hopeful about the future is that the Hispanic community is very focused on the private sector. So 8 out of 10 Hispanics are employed in the private sector, and they are the demographic least likely to work in government, in the public sector. So essentially, they do have a natural and ingrained distrust of the government or working in the public sector. They also don't necessarily have networks tied into the public sector here in the United States, but they are private sector and entrepreneurially oriented. So California, Texas, Florida have the highest number of Hispanic-owned businesses. The average top line revenue of these businesses, about $500,000, or so. And that is versus about $700,000 for the average small entrepreneurial business in the United States in the general population. Okay, so we've heard a lot. The reason we hear a lot about the Hispanic community, without question, aside from immigration, is politics. 21 million eligible Latino voters, and here we are. I think the Republican slate will be a very interesting one. I actually have high hopes for at least turning the conversation a bit more favorably in our direction. We'll see what happens, but I think we have some representatives that at least will make the case in a much more intelligent way than what we've seen in the last several voting cycles, I think. And without question, there'll be a big get out the vote. The Democrats have a couple of very important networks that are worth noting. The first one is Univision. So Univision is as much a media company as it is a social activist network. They have networking facilities that provide educational information, healthcare information, but just as actively, the heads of Univision are very connected to liberal and democratic forces to really put forth a liberal agenda unabashedly. So that's really an important. National Council de la Raza is probably the most important liberal and highly liberal organizational network. They're funded by tens of millions of dollars to get out the vote, on the Democratic side. So we have our own networks growing, at least on the conservative side, but they're still very minor in comparison to what's happening on the left. But I think nothing really appeals more to the community as being activated, being touched, being visited. I think the notion of reaching out to the community should not be underestimated. So the differences in the Latino community, I thought I would just go through very quickly. That as you can see, the bulk of the Hispanic community or the Latino community in the United States is Mexican, 65%, and then the rest from the Caribbean countries, as we see. All other Hispanics are from South America. So again, it wouldn't surprise you that, again, we've seen a lot of migration from Venezuela, Argentina, and Ecuador, et cetera, Peru. And that's been hitting. So what are what are the reasons I think that the community has been less fiscally or less commercially active? I think religion does play a part in the commercial activity. I think there has been, and it's probably not very, I have to be careful how I put this, but essentially the gap between rich and poor in South America is accepted. That path to climbing up the ladder is not as realistically understood in the community as it is in other cultures. And the role of economic achievement, financial achievement, wealth creation is not as practiced in this community. I think that religion, which focuses on the afterlife and what could be achieved in the afterlife and getting prepared for that is an emphasis that can't be underestimated. So I'm not quite sure. We can talk about that at another time, but I have a lot more commentary on that. In any case, back to the economic issues, the growth in Hispanic-owned businesses, I see them really continuing to grow, probably more so in Texas and Florida. California and the West will probably become a little more difficult because of certainly the tax situations and many other issues, I think, that prevent the regulatory issues, the drought, et cetera. So we see most likely the growth patterns to be much more aggressive in Texas, the Southeast, and Florida. These statistics basically continue to emphasize what I've been saying, a fast growth. Certainly the numbers are impressive, 43% growth rate, but what we have to do is really get the Latino community in the financial sector. Right now, only 6% of Latinos are in the financial sector, and only 2% are in the technology industry. And probably less than 1% are in real estate development. So what we're looking at is a situation where a huge community is not represented in the most lucrative wealth-creating industries in the United States. And I think until that's really addressed and changed, in addition to regulatory decline so that they can start businesses and operate more freely, that will be the case. U.S. corporations, it hasn't been lost on the Hispanic community and how to really appeal to them. One size doesn't fit all, and there are lots of interesting stories about that, but in lieu of time, we can always come back. So one of my favorite books have come out recently, Ann Coulter, one of my favorite entertainers here. And there will always be a lot of skepticism about how a new demographic, particularly one as large as this one, and how they will adversely affect, particularly the United States. I am completely confident that we will see a swing in the next, decade or so. But until then, I think there'll be a lot of naysayers. The immigration debate aggravated the debate here. It didn't really help things. There's no way I see any resolution to it anytime soon, and I can take questions on that topic as need be. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll take questions.
Very much
Sure.
enjoyed the presentation. I just had a question about you started by contrasting or comparing the Latin American immigration and the Asian immigration. The breakdown, I'll use the word breakdown, I don't know, or the transformation of the family culture and the out-of-wedlock black births and so forth that seem to be impacting the Latin American and Caribbean immigrant community economically. I have basically two questions. One is there an analysis or explanation? Is it like stability of institutions, churches, or community institutions, or just the popular
Why the out of birth has happened?
Right, and then the second question would be, is that also being seen in the Asian immigration population?
Yeah, well, I think the first one is, of course, the Catholic Church, and again, and I certainly, was impacted by this to some degree. The Catholic Church prohibits birth control, and abortion, and so the Catholic influence has a tendency to create single mothers, and because being a single mother in the United States has lost its stigma, then therefore I think the rise of single parenthood has accelerated Again, if you go to Latin countries, there's a huge stigma about being a single mother. And that stigma, I think, really controlled the rate of unwed birth.
Would that increased single parenthood also be seen in the Asian community that you sort of compared?
Much less so. So I think there's much more care as far as that's concerned. And there's much more attention given to the consequences of becoming a single parent.
Are there any kind of interventions, in terms of the economic impact on the community of the single parenthood and the dropping out of high school and early entry into the workforce without, potential for greater education and greater aspirations? Are there systemic interventions?
I mean, I think it would be great to have some cultural pressure placed back on it. Why do I think that? Because again, the evidence is clear that if you don't have a high school education and you become a single parent, you're really going to be stuck in the poverty chain. And the success chain is basically finishing high school, getting to college, getting a job, and then getting married. And two parents have a better economic prospect than one. So I think along that success chain, a lot happens to prevent them from really becoming more independent.
Are you able to offer any suggestions to anybody, business owners, people running for public office, to counter, I believe the term used was vitriol against undocumented workers?
Oh, right, yeah.
Because it's all about emotions, whether it's they're taking our jobs, whatever it is, and I know that there's no basis to it, but countering the emotion that's coming from is something I've run into problems with. And any suggestions?
I agree. Yeah, I agree. Let me also mention one final thing I didn't mention. The bilingual education program in California and elsewhere was the worst thing that could have happened to Latino immigrants ever. It was a distinct change from when my parents came. My mother didn't speak English when she came to this country. I mean, they put us in school and you spoke English, and that was the end of it. Like, there was never a debate. And so the notion that there were special classes, they're now third generation Mexicans in LA that don't speak English. So that's the worst thing that could have been done to enhance economic opportunity, not only in the United States, in any home country. To your point, I think, again, when you look at the left side of the left's argument here, I think they glorify the notion that there's no need to speak English in the United States, that it's only the nativists that think that you should be speaking English. And I think that so much has been done. The notion that, trying to find a legal pathway, let's talk about solutions, let's not, the left pushes forth the path to citizenship or nothing option. And I think, again, that automatic right response to that, let me make it clear. The response to that argument by being angry about it instead of not looking at the logic of path to citizenship has always been a bogus argument, because as I mentioned, even if you do everything right, it's going to take you 12 years to be a citizen. And when they were promoting the path to citizen bogus plan, for the undocumented workers that were here, offering them a path to citizenship, after the permanent residents that were already here, if they added another 10 million people on top of that, you're talking 20, 25 years. Who makes plans for that? It was a completely bogus, it's as bogus as the global warming debate. Is it happening or is it not happening? That's not even a debate to have. So the point that I'm saying is that if we could just lower the rhetoric to, this is the logic of the situation, and we're not going to get tied into.
But that's been the problem perpetually, is trying to counter emotion with logic. I mean,
yes,
I don't have a problem with the logic.
Yes.
And in my opinion, the best way to do it is, as you pointed out, because my whole family is immigrants. My father was born in Germany, okay? And you don't have to pass a law like a path to citizenship. You simply have to say, you're in America, all official documents will be printed in English and English only.
Right. Absolutely. And make it wouldn't you want to speak English? If you're bilingual, you have the opportunity to double your income. If you can speak 2 languages fluently, you've automatically doubled your income prospects. If you go to community college and learn how to program code, you can double your income in a year. So my point is that why don't we focus the argument away from path to citizenship to why don't you become a guest worker or try to work towards that and learn to become bilingual and improve your skills. There would be countless industries where you can have economic prospects. Number 2, I think another thing I've tried to use in my dialogue is why isn't the United States in dialogue with Mexico and the Central American countries? I had a short stint in the foreign policy world, and we have stopped talking to these countries, or at least engaging them. Why are millions of your citizens coming across the border? If 10 million Americans were going across the Canadian border, I'm sure the Canadians would be in DC going, what's going on? So the notion, or any nation, so essentially I think we haven't diplomatically addressed the issue and put the heat on, I think, these countries that are most engaged in this element.
Thank you.
By the way, America is now behind Canada on economic freedom, so we may be doing that.
I wouldn't be surprised if,
And by the way, my mother's family were Italian, and guess what? When they came here, and her aunts and uncles, they had to speak English.
You speak English. I don't see why that's turned into an adverse
Right.
element. And by the way, it's illegal to cross the border into Mexico and not have a visa or not have.
But two quick points. First of all, I've argued with conservative Republicans that their views are outrageous, that they should be celebrating even undocumented immigrants, because if they were poverty-stricken Mexicans, let's say, whose options were watch their family suffer, watch themselves suffer, or say, screw the wretched bureaucrats in the United States and the wretched idiots, who you can't get through the system because, after all, you're not rich. The only moral thing to do would be to say, screw all of this, I'm coming to America, I'm standing in front of the Home Depot, I'm working my ass off, I'm becoming American. That Republicans should celebrate these people, and that they're just showing that they're moral midgets if they don't do that. And I'm curious, if you get reaction from that. The other thing is, what do we do with undocumented aliens? One suggestion that I stole from Ed Crane at Cato is that, your punishment, if you want a path to being here permanently as a resident, maybe even a citizen, is that your penalty is you will never receive Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment compensation. Now, on the other hand, you won't ever pay taxes for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, so forth. How about a penalty like that? Do you think that would be a penalty to, for such people?
You mean for the undocumented or for the people that are opposed? I'm sorry.
No, I mean for the undocumented. I'm sort of doing that
like
tongue in cheek, but the idea is to say, okay, your penalty is you won't receive any of these government benefits, and you'll never have to pay taxes for any of these government benefits.
Right. I think that's happening now. And in many ways, I think there is a fallacy. If you really look at the data, they really aren't collecting the entitlements or the welfare. But there's fraud, like there's fraud in anything, and I'm sure there are operations where there's some illegal activity on top of illegal activity. But the point is that I always thought that, look, if you come here and you pay taxes and then you can work, I think there would be more than enough people who would be happy to do that. I think the plan for many of these undocumented workers is to go back to Mexico. Why? Because a lower cost of living, significantly lower cost of living, and it probably wouldn't surprise any of you that I think within 10 years, I think there'll be a flow of people from California going down to Mexico, because we're going to, double-digit inflation at some point will take place. California is an economic mess. And so I do think that many of this community will see a very big change, I think, in 15 to 20 years. That's my speculation about and as you know, this is the market cycle. When the market cycle, moves, eventually it turns back. But right now, I think the debate, it's not a logical one or even willing to take the time.
Yeah. What about the reaction? Have you tried this argument on Republicans and conservatives that they're completely wrong morally about immigration, not just economically, but why are they
The evangelicals,
penalizing,
Ralph Reed's conference is going on right now in D.C., right? So, so if, yeah, a wonderful man, an operator. But I didn't say that. The mic is still on. But in any case, so the evangelicals have definitely made the moral case. But Heritage is much more heavily bankrolled than Ralph Reed.
I used to work for Heritage back when they were on the side of good, and then they've really fallen off, frankly.
They aren't as open-minded. On the other hand, now again, I actually think that years and years and years of this deserves some address. And I actually, when I was managing money even 20 years ago, Southern California was hit hard by the healthcare costs. You had a lot of anchor babies. You had a lot of those hospital systems that weren't equipped to deal with all of the, And so those communities have to pay a cost in terms of healthcare, educational pressure, et cetera. So they deserve some understanding in terms of the immigration pressure.
Thank you very much, first off.
Sure.
So I'm struck as I listen to you speak. I have a good friend my friend and his wife, they're in their 60s, and they immigrated from Argentina. Mm-hmm. And I was sitting in their living room, and we were talking about immigration and so on. And it's funny, I was much more pro-immigration than he was. Because his fear is that what we see now, and just so you know, I edit a website called Against Crony Capitalism. Mm-hmm. And his fear is that this kind of tradition of the strong man, in Argentina, the Peronistas, mm-hmm. that is the game. And it seems like there's an interesting tug of war within the community, as far as I can see, seeing it from the outside. The Univision side, which is thoroughly statist,
right,
and then the entrepreneurial side.
The top management of Univision isn't even Mexican.
Really?
No. Hayam Saban is not Mexican.
No kidding. No, I did not know that.
Not. It's a total sham. And they are completely funding the Clinton campaign. Unabashedly, Obama. It's a sham. But I'm interrupting you.
What I want to know is how do we? Because it seems to me, I look around and I go, gosh, I sure wish we had more guys like my plumber in this country, and way fewer of the guys that sit in City Hall. You know? Well, I mean, I'd much rather have an entrepreneur in my community than somebody who's living off the state. But how do we, because it looks like we're at an inflection point here. How do we kind of push it over to the entrepreneurial side? Because I'm scared to death that we're going to have this whole group of folks that are going to be, and these are the Republicans, this is Ann Coulter, they're going to come in and they are going to be absolute statists, and they're going to import this whole way of looking at the world. Kind of the Peronista sort of way of looking at things.
Well, who is the
immigrants coming into the
immigrants.
country? Yes.
I think that now again the argument that the United States makes, even like the argument that Hugo Chavez makes, is that we're going to take care of you. We're going to take care of your poverty. We're going to take care of you, and so I think that there is some. That's how the Democrats approach them. When they set up these gatherings. We're going to take care of you. We're going to address your educational needs. We will pay for your education. So there is that. As far as the strongman feel, I didn't
really mean the strongman. I just mean kind of just statism in general. But just that tradition. Anyway. You addressed my point. Yeah,
I think again the countries that you just mentioned don't necessarily get along either, and they are accustomed to the strongman role. I haven't wrapped my mind around that, except if you thought the educational gap was big here in the United States, it's significant in Mexico. It's significant, less so in Argentina.
Well, I'll say one last thing. Mm-hmm. I thought it was you said it in passing. You mentioned kind of the afterlife as being a driving thing. Fatalismo. I was in the Dominican Republic, and nobody was, my friend was a doctor. No one wore seatbelts. They're like, hey, whatever happens, happens. And I mean, and that's very interesting. I hadn't thought of that in a long time, and I can
It's
see
a
how that
very
really
strong issue.
influences
It's a
politics.
very strong issue, and we can get into the the discussion of the Pope and how he's not helping matters by describing socialism as a good thing and capitalism as a bad thing. God bless him. But the point is that he's misdirecting he's misdirecting the point of view of why prosperity is a good thing. Prosperity is a good thing because it enhances stability and economic prospects for everyone, and they never seem to nail that down.
Okay, I think we're. Okay, I'm sorry, Dale. Come on up.
Yeah, a quick question. Just curious, do you happen to know how many of these people is Chile experiencing a big immigration?
No, Chile has been, the interesting thing about Chile is, they were initially run by the University of Chicago guys. The economic element there is still stable, but the economic growth is not as, I think the economic output has slowed a bit, but they're still very stable. Contrary to looking at them as a great example for educational achievement and economic development and prosperity, they were viewed with envy by the other countries, and so they didn't pick up on it. It's a very interesting, development from that standpoint. But no, the immigration to the United States now is definitely happening. Ecuador, Peru.
Ecuador and Peru, they're right next to Chile. Are any of them moving to Chile?
Oh, no. They would come north before they would go south. From that standpoint.
Clara, when you and Will and I were talking about your presentation beforehand and setting it up, one of the things that we talked about was the cultural aspects that you talked a little bit about, but also invited questions. I wanted to go back to a point that came up in that conversation that we'd had a month ago or 2 months ago. Objectivists have a lot in common with, at least with the American sense of life, and probably with a lot of the values that bring immigrants here, have always brought immigrants here, and probably continue to be big factors with Hispanic and Latino immigration. But we also know that objectivism is has very strong positions that are not widespread. We call them the nuts. One is religion, the atheism. Another one is self-interest, a strong belief in the propriety of an egoist ethic. And then the third is the really complete laissez-faire, which we share with libertarians. And the question that we were talking about, and I invite some further thought from you, is which of those is most amenable to reach, on which of those points is there the greatest chance of success now and in the near future of reaching out to a Hispanic population in light of the cultural values that they have?
Yeah, I think as we did talk, religion is probably a non-starter. Again, when you're talking about 61% of the population are Catholic, and then the other 20 and growing are evangelical Protestants. And I was mentioning to you on Facebook, I Facebook colleagues at all educational levels and attainable levels, and God is part of the conversation every day. It's a fascinating thing. I say that as a cynical, lapsed Catholic probably, but the point is that, I'm actually struck by it, and it's almost a marketing tool. It's almost a community building thing, So that, to say there's no God or religion is not part of the dialogue would be difficult. I think emphasizing and achieving, focusing on the self-interest and business accomplishments and commercial activity and reason. And Dale, you mentioned something interesting in your talk about why economic activity can help prolong your life, or economic prosperity prolongs your life. So if you're lagging by 100% in terms of income and educational achievement, you're really not living your life for your grandchildren or those types. So those are the areas I would really focus on. And the good news is that, more or less when you're kind of at the bottom, you can really only go up. And so I think that there is room for someone to make that argument and be successful at it, and be creative with it. Because at the end of the day, I really think the main issue that has not introduced this group to either libertarian or conservative groups has been lack of when you're not invited to the party, you really don't know the party's going on. You know, that's what I think.
This is a really minor question, I guess. I was just thinking out loud to myself, you were talking about English and the importance of English in America, in the U.S. It's something I'm of two minds about as someone who speaks Spanish at home with his kids and raised them bilingually. But I wanted that for them to be cosmopolitan, but I'm sort of indifferent to language. But what I was going to ask was, one of the huge changes in Latin America over the last generation that I've noticed is the massive increase in English language education there. When I was in my 20s and first traveled to Latin America, if you spoke English, you were out of luck. It was just, there were parts of, say, South America where it was just not happening. Even in Mexico, I was in Guadalajara, nobody spoke English. But in recent trips to Latin America, I've just noticed that lots and lots of schools now offer, lots of English education. Lots of people are studying English. And I wonder if that would end up impacting the immigrant populations we get.
I think that's a great thing. I think the technology and the technology potential and the media potential has helped enhance English language around the world, including South America. And again, I think mass immigration happens for lots of reasons, escaping the dictator, and the like. But what's happened recently has been escaping, poverty, absolute poverty, because the bulk of the migration took place between 1990 and 2004, and Mexico blew up about 3 times during that period of time. And so the poverty and the lack of interest of the government to solve those poverty issues, Mexico has off-site shale formations and shale possibilities of over 1 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and they have more economic resources, natural resources, and South America the same, and so they just don't choose to address it, and so it's very, very the poor that come here, and when the U.S. or the places where they immigrate to, whether it's California or even Southern Florida, which worries me, doesn't encourage English, then they've lost their bilingual. There are bilingual jobs that will be a bonanza in healthcare, in the financial services, in legal. There are all kinds, in media even. There are lots of possibilities. So there could be more of an educated class already left in Mexico than here, is what I'm saying, Will. That's what's happened from that country, from Mexico in particular. If you go to South Florida, and go to Coral Gables, then the Venezuelans and the South Americans that have come are much higher education and achievement business people.
Yeah, I have the impression that Miami is the capital of Caribbean Latin America anyway. Like in Central America, it's a central reference point for everyone. A lot of business comes out of there, goes through there. That's my impression, anyway.
When you say business, they're living there now.
Miami.
Yeah.
Business to do with Latin America.
Yes.
Goes through there.
Yes.
That's even cultural events.
It's a huge economic powerhouse.
Yeah.
I apologize that I don't have a haiku. I was totally spellbound by her presentation to write one. Yes. I do want to confirm, because I have a place in Miami, North Miami Beach.
Oh, yes.
And it's, over the last 25 years, I have seen it grow so that the Hispanic community is the vast majority of people there. Some towns are 85%.
I know.
There is no need for anyone to talk English. Almost everything is in 2 languages, and sometimes they just don't even bother with the English part. It's all Spanish.
I've been at stores where 10 years ago where it said English spoken here. So
exactly.
In Miami, yeah.
So I'm feeling I should really learn more Spanish, because then I will feel more comfortable. There are places that they don't even speak English at all. You want to be waited on, you have to point to sign language or use.
Well, I don't doubt that there are business opportunities and lots of interesting opportunities that will come out of it.
They don't need English anymore, and I think that's going to grow.
Well, again, I think in Southern Florida in particular, I think I don't see Venezuela getting better anytime soon. You know? so they're here to stay for a while. A pleasure.
I came late to your talk, so forgive me if you already addressed this, but I'm wondering about on the anti-immigration side, if there's a kind of a visceral nationalism or cultural nationalism that factors into it. And just a couple of data points. I grew up in Canada, and all through my childhood, there was lots of commerce back and forth with the United States, but there was always a very pronounced stream of resentment, right, against Americans who would come and open a bank account in Toronto or have a cottage in Northern Ontario or Quebec. And the idea was that there's Canadianness and there's Americanness, and in some sense those need to be kept, right, distinct.
Yes.
And the other data point is in Argentina, there is a significant amount of immigration into Argentina from Paraguay and Bolivia. And when I'm down there and I'm speaking with very cosmopolitan, market-friendly people in my intellectual circle there, but even there's a strong resentment against the large number of peoples who are coming from the interior. And the idea there seems to be that culturally and nationally they are very different, right? That there's an Argentine-ness that is going to be taken away, and so
Yes.
naturally they feel a certain kind of resentment. So I'm wondering in the American context if there's a similar kind of visceral notion of Americanness, and that people are just seen as kind of alien nationals, and we can't be who we are if we
There's
let
no
too many
question
of them
about
in.
it. You know, to answer your first question, definitely.
So the question would be what the proper
Yeah.
response to that is, or how to deal with it.
Well, I'll tell you how I've dealt with it, and because you know, I would say, let's use Ann Coulter's book as an example. You know, she would articulate many of the nativist feelings about this immigration debate. Now, Ann Coulter's book reminds me of the Truman Capote quote that, you know, it's not writing, it's typing, you know. So the statistics are ridiculous. She says 1/4 of the Mexican population moved to the United States, and she doesn't take into account the birth rate and really what's happening, you know, child rape. I mean, as if the only thing immigrants do here is, you know, rape and pillage, you know, the population, and I can go on. But so definitely there's a group of people, but the same thing also happened to a lesser degree. But if you really read stories about the immigration patterns, the Irish and the Italians when they came, and we were talking about this yesterday, Adam, the Catholics. You know, my God, the Catholics were going to come over here, and the Pope was going to be running things, and they don't have blonde hair, you know, well, the Irish do. But the point is that whole notion of waves, there was a wave of Chinese that came, and that was very adversely, you know, impacted. I think there was an Indian immigration that was cut off 100 years ago, and they only allowed 100 Indians to come to the United States. So there's always been a cultural adversity to big waves of immigration. To answer your other question, I think life is, like it or not, it is tribal, and so there's almost no way around that. If anything, the thing I glory about in the United States is certainly freedom, and economic prosperity is a fabulous thing. I think it's something to really champion, and I do have all the optimism in the world that this culture will adopt it strongly in the years to come.